Hello, thanks for tuning in. My name is Franz Altner. I'm a PhD student at the University of Vienna, and today I want to present to you, give you an outline of a theory of group agency. And I want to do this in 3 steps. First, I want to discuss List and Pettit's renowned theory of moral group agency or group personhood. And in a second step, present an objection against that theory, which comes down to showing that List and Pettit's theory can't distinguish between intentional group actions and mere activity. In the last part of the talk, I will then propose a solution to that problem, an extension to their theory, by arguing that we have to add a constitutive end of agency to the theory in order to draw these distinctions. Now, for a summary of List and Pettit's account of rational group agency, you can check out the background video I uploaded. Now I want to jump straight into List and Pettit's account of group personhood, because this will be the relevant claim that I want to look at later on. Now, List and Pettit take a group to be a person if it can perform effectively within the space of obligations. And it can perform effectively within the space of obligations if it can engage in self-interrogation. Self-interrogation requires that it has aggregation functions that ensure consistency and complete group attitudes, so that, for example, say book club doesn't just form group attitudes on what book to read next, but also on normative propositions, such as what book it should read next. Or, for example, for corporation must also be able to count as a person, must also be able to form attitudes on normative propositions such as doing X is good, or we shouldn't do epsilon. Now, this is very similar to the kind of phenomenon of reasoning that we looked at in the group reasoning that we looked at in the background video. Now, when a group is capable of self-interrogation, it can also act intentionally, and it can act intentionally if the members' actions are controlled by a group intention, which is formed on the basis of relevant group desires and beliefs. And these relevant desires can be desires to do what is good or to be moral. Okay. I now want to argue that List and Pettit's account of group personhood can't distinguish between intentional group actions and group activities. And the case of misappropriation that you see here brings this problem to light. Now I'll just read to you. A restaurant, Vienna Schnitzel, is led by 2 managers, Bob and Sue, who share ownership with Anne, who's external to the restaurant. External, I mean she's not involved in day-to-day management. In their position as managers, Bob and Sue intend to misappropriate the restaurant's funds by agreeing to buy a car because they no longer want to use the really good Viennese public transportation system for their private tours. They buy the car and end up using it for personal trips for 90% of the time, and only occasionally use it to make trips to the farmer's market. When Anne finds out about this, she argues that they should reimburse the restaurant for the costs of the car, citing the business judgment rule, and finally Anne sues them successfully. Now, what is going on in the misappropriation case? Well, we can first note that Sue and Bob's buying of the car is attributable to the restaurant, given their role in the hierarchy, they're the managers, and the relevant aggregation mechanism. Their actions are consistent with their other choices on behalf of Vienna Schnitzel, which means that the aggregation mechanism yields consistent group attitudes, which allows us to adopt the intentional stance. Now, adopting the intentional stance, we can see that the action implies that they do not care about the restaurant's well-being, and we can actually also assume that they have actively talked to each other and said that they don't really care about the well-being of the restaurant. Now, this is also known as a conflict of interest. Their interest in using the money of the restaurant for their private kind of endeavors is in conflict with certain kinds of normal, typical aims of the corporation. Nevertheless, according to List and Pettit's framework, buying the car is an intentional action by the restaurant because it is the output of the relevant aggregation mechanism, and it gives rise to the relevant action. So List and Pettit's framework can't really label this action as a mere group activity. It's forced to label it as a group action. Now, why would we think? I mean, we could maybe just agree with List and Pettit, and actually many people that have presented this do. They just say, well, List and Pettit are right. This is a group action. It's up to this. It's up to Sue and Bob, and they've decided this way, and it's consistent, and so on and so on. So it's actually group action. Now, the business judgment rule would disagree with them. Now, the business judgment rule provides a legal framework or legal argument for cases of conflicts of interest. It states that the director shall perform his or her duties in good faith in a manner he or she reasonably believes to be in the best interests of the corporation, and such care as an ordinary prudent person in a like position would use under similar circumstances. Now, I want to bring your attention to this aspect of the business judgment rule, namely that it states that a director has to reasonably believe that the actions are in the best interests of the corporation. Now, intuitively, and as the case is stated, Sue and Bob's actions are in the interest of the corporation. They don't care about the corporation. They want to satisfy their own interests. Now, the business judgment rule works as follows. So actions that fall under the business judgment rule count as full-fledged actions by the corporation, which also mean that the corporation is responsible for them. So any action where the manager can make plausible that she believed that the action, that the choice she was making on behalf of the company was in the best interest of the corporation will be protected by the business judgment rule. Now, when an action of a manager is not covered by the business judgment rule, like Susan Bob's decision to buy a car, she herself has to take responsibility for the action. So, for example, she has to make up the lost money that the restaurant incurred by buying the car. Now, the business judgment rule suggests that the corporation is not in control in conflict of interest cases, but the members as individuals are. Bob and Sue's buying of the car is not an intentional group action, but the intentional action of the individuals who hijacked the group agent. The interests of the group agent are not fully determined by its members, but to a certain extent independent from their inputs. But this last point is a point that List and Pettit can't make, because in their account, if in a dictatorial system, for example, if the managers determine, if the managers don't care about the corporation and act in a way that these desires don't make it to the group level, or that the desire that the corporation acts in a way that is like in a kind of self-beneficial way. If the managers don't act in this way, these desires don't reach a group level, and the group will only have desires such as benefiting Sue and Bob. The underlying philosophical intuition is that considerations that are in conflict with the restaurant's independent interests cannot function as reasons that are endorsed by the corporation itself. List and Pettit's account of group actions treats considerations that give rise to a group action as reasons that do not have the functional profile of reasons. So they are motivational reasons, but the desire to benefit Sue and Bob is a desire that is not endorsed by the corporation. It isn't really a reason. Here I just want to highlight that these underlying philosophical intuitions are intuitions that underlie the business judgment rule. And these philosophical intuitions aren't captured by List and Pettit's account of intentional group action. Now, to address this problem, I propose adding the aim of group self-intelligibility as a constitutive aim of autonomous intentional agency to List and Pettit's account of group agency. Now, the aim of group self-intelligibility as a constitutive aim of intentional action is actually taken from David Velleman's account of group agency, and is an aim that is very typical for narrative-based accounts of agency. If we add this, if we say that a group acts intentionally only if it aims at intentional action, then my thesis is that we can distinguish between, or my claim is that we can distinguish between intentional group actions and mere group activities. But how to understand group self-intelligibility? Here should be a double point. I want to understand it in the following way. When I say that in Xing, so Xing is an action, a group action or group activity, G aims at group self-intelligibility, I mean that X makes sense from G's point of view. And here I'm taking a kind of conceptual, slightly the conceptual framework that List and Pettit develop. Although I interpret the point of view differently from List and Pettit, where the point of view in List and Pettit is simply the set of all mental states that we attribute to the group, I intended to mean something different. Now, so I define group self-intelligibility as follows. First, as I said in the last slide, I take it to mean that X makes sense from G's point of view. And this is the case if and only if the relevant members M1 to Mn take G to be the causally efficacious unit with regard to X and any non-X alternatives. So it's up to the group to act. And two, if the relevant members would be able to explain X by embedding it within a narrative that contains the group's practical identity, its circumstances, and its other mental states, which must be sufficiently shared among the group's members. Now, the main difference here is that the idea that group self-intelligibility entails this idea of embedding an action within a narrative, and this narrative contains the group's practical identity. And this is the main difference, I take it, between, as we will see, between the view that I offer here and List and Pettit. Now, my claim is that using the notion of a group's practical identity allows us to draw the distinction between group activities and group intentional actions. Now, how to understand a group's practical identity? Here I need to take a step back and first explore with you the idea of legal statuses as they were developed by Searle, Frank Hendricks, and others. To understand legal statuses, consider that certain types of institutions, like limited liability companies or universities, are granted typical normative rights and privileges by external institutions. The Bureau of Corporations. I should have looked it up. These normative attributes combine to characteristic normative statuses, which contain or specify all the different normative rights and privileges that a limited liability company, for example, has. For example, it has the right to sue someone or the right to take up a loan. Now, the existence of these types of agents, universities, and limited liability companies depends on the external ascription or collective acceptance of these normative statuses by institutions external to them. And now finally, a very important tool that we will need in a second to flesh out what the practical identity of a group is, are constitutive rules. Constitutive rules specify the conditions under which a group can be said to have a certain normative status. So, for example, a university must have professors that can give people degrees, and so on. A limited liability company must sign certain certificates, otherwise it will not be collectively accepted. Or a limited liability company also has to have the aim of making profit. Otherwise, it will not be accepted at a certain point as a for-profit corporation. Now, finally, we can come to the notion of practical group identity I want to use for the definition of self-intelligibility group self-intelligibility that I mentioned, that I laid out before. For this, consider first here, because I will maybe that you have some concrete predicates to associate with the definition right now. Let P be the practical identity of a for-profit corporation, let E be the aim of making profits, and let R refer to a hierarchy in which the board of directors settles final decisions. Now, a group's external practical identity can be given as the following conditional, namely that if a set of constitutive rules of the form X is represented as P under condition C apply to group G, where the conditions C require a set of typical group mental states, E, such as, for example, making profits, and intergroup relations R, for example, having a hierarchy in which the owner is at the top and has a final say, or in which the managers are at the top and have a final say. And for G to count as P, so as a for-profit corporation, requires the continuing fulfillment of these conditions, then P determines part of G's practical identity, PI. So PI is then a more general practical identity that is not only restricted to the practical identity of a for-profit corporation, but also contains past actions and a more kind of individual personality of the corporation. Maybe the corporation is a restaurant, or maybe it is a fast food chain, or maybe it is specialized in producing phones. So all these aspects will be in the practical identity PI, but among them will also be those conditions that are specified by the constitutive rule that applies to our group. Now, with this definition in hand, we can go back to Bob and Sue and see that Bob and Sue's action is not group self-intelligible, since their aim to buy a car for their private use cannot be explained by embedding it in a narrative where the practical identity consists partly of aiming at maximizing profits by selling food. Now, since buying a car for their own benefits, that doesn't add anything to the profit capability of the group, cannot be explained within such a narrative. It doesn't make sense from the group's perspective. If it doesn't make sense from the group's perspective, then it's not group self-intelligible, and then it's not an intentional action, but an activity. So Bob and Sue's choice to buy cars are intentional actions. I'm just summing it up here. Buy the restaurant, but it is their own intentional action enabled by misappropriating the restaurant's funds. This is the presentation. Thanks if you've kept going and listened to the end. I am really happy to talk to you and hear your thoughts on my presentation. Thanks for the attention.